When I first rolled up the gravel road that led to my late grandfather's land, a wide stretch of green fields, oak trees, and a cozy old farmhouse that had stood for over a century, I didn't think I'd be stirring up a storm with the neighborhood's self proclaimed queen bee, better known as HOA Karen. The truth was simple. Grandpa's land was outside any official homeowners association, grandfathered into the county zoning laws long before developers turned the surrounding acres into cookie cutter subdivisions. But the moment I parked my truck and began unloading moving boxes, I could feel the weight of disapproving eyes from across the street. Karen's house was the one with the perfectly trimmed hedges, a flagpole taller than her roof, and a smug sign that read Proud HOA Community. She came striding over before I could even carry the first box inside, demanding to see my approval paperwork. Asking what colors I planned to paint the house, how many cars would be parked on the property, and if I had paid my HOA dues. And when I calmly explained that my grandfather's land wasn't part of her HOA, that I was moving onto private, exempt property passed down through generations, she twisted her lips into a thin smile and said, "Well, around here, we all follow the same rules, whether you like it or not." I brushed it off, assuming she was just being nosy, but within hours she was back, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of my truck, my boxes, even the rusty old barn out. Back, muttering about violations as if she had jurisdiction over me. And I'll admit, at first I thought it was funny, like watching someone play dress up as a cop when they clearly had no badge. But by the end of that first week, Karen's antics turned from mild nuisance into outright harassment. She pounded on my door at 6 in the morning to complain that the rooster crowing in the barn disturbed her peaceful mornings. She left pamphlets in my mailbox about HOA guidelines that didn't apply to me, and she even told a contractor I'd hired to help patch the roof that he couldn't work without HOA approval, nearly scaring the poor guy off the job. Every time I reminded her that her authority ended at the edge of her own property line, she got more shrill, insisting this entire neighborhood answers to me. And I started to realize that she wasn't just bluffing, she genuinely believed she had some kind of power over my land. Grandpa had always warned me that people like Karen thrived on control, but I hadn't expected her obsession to escalate so quickly, and by the time I planted my first vegetable patch in the backyard, she had already filed 3 bogus complaints with the county zoning board, none of which stuck because, again, my land wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, but that didn't stop her from trying, and it didn't stop the tension from building until one day she crossed a line so bold it would end with flashing lights and handcuffs right in front of her. Perfect little lawn. The breaking point came on a muggy Saturday morning, the kind where the sun beat down heavy on the fields and the cicadas buzzed like they were playing backup to my hammering as I worked on repairing one of Grandpa's old fences. Because that was the day Karen decided she was no longer content with barking orders from across the street. She came marching straight onto my property without permission, her arms crossed like she was about to deliver a presidential decree, and started shouting about how my tools were unsightly, my truck was junk clutter, and how all residents in this neighborhood are required to maintain uniform appearances, as though I were a child who had left toys on a carpet she claimed to own. And I tried, with every ounce of patience in me, to explain again that this land wasn't hers, wasn't the HOA's, wasn't subject to any of their cookie-cutter rules, but she cut me off, shrieking about how she'd report me until I complied. I told her bluntly to get off my property, but instead she pulled out her phone and started live streaming, narrating to whoever watched that she was documenting noncompliance and that the HOA board will deal with this trespasser. And that word, trespasser, hit me harder than I expected, because this wasn't just her being annoying anymore. This was her openly trying to rewrite the truth and pretend I was squatting on my own land. I warned her one last time that she had no authority here, that if she didn't leave, I'd call the sheriff, but she laughed in my face, saying, "The sheriff listens to us, not you," and stormed off, heels clicking in the gravel like she had won something. An hour later, I got my first taste of how far she was willing to push, because a county deputy's car pulled into my driveway, lights flashing, and for a split second I thought maybe she was right, maybe her lies had worked. But when the deputy stepped out, hat tipped low, and expression halfway between confusion and apology, he explained that a concerned HOA representative had called in a report claiming a trespasser was illegally occupying the farmhouse, and that he had to check it out, I handed him Grandpa's deed, my driver's license, and even showed him the old county plat map where the boundary lines clearly separated my land from the HOA, and the deputy chuckled, shaking his head, muttering, figured this was one of Karen's games, before assuring me there was no problem and heading back to his cruiser. I thought that might scare her off, but instead it emboldened her because later that same day, she rallied 3 of her HOA buddies, marched them right up to my porch, and announced loudly enough for the entire street to hear that I was in violation of multiple ordinances and that I was hereby fined $300 for having an unapproved fence design. And when I told her to leave or I'd start recording for evidence of harassment, she sneered and said, "Record all you want, sweetheart. The law's on my side," before slapping a fake notice taped to my front door like she had served me some official summons. I tore it down, tossed it in the trash, and decided enough was enough. If she wanted a battle, she was going to get one. But I was going to do it the right way by documenting every intrusion, every false report, every bogus notice, so when she finally went too far, the sheriff wouldn't just laugh it off. He'd finally put her in her place, and sure enough, I wouldn't have to wait long for Karen to cross that final line, because the more I ignored her fake fines and the more she realized her HOA friends couldn't bully me into compliance, the more desperate and reckless she became, until the day came when she tried to drag me into her world by force, and it ended with the one outcome she never imagined: her wrists in handcuffs while the whole neighborhood watched. By the following week, I had already collected a small stack of evidence against Karen: photos of the fake violation notices she kept taping to my door, recordings of her screaming at me from the edge of my driveway, even screenshots of her HOA group's social media posts where she rallied her minions to deal with the outsider. But nothing could have prepared me for the stunt she pulled next, because one morning, just as I was finishing my coffee on the porch, I saw a tow truck creeping up my gravel drive. The driver looking uneasy as Karen marched proudly behind him, clipboard in hand, shouting that my illegally parked vehicle was being seized by order of the HOA. I nearly spit my coffee out laughing because the truck she was pointing at was my old Ford pickup, parked squarely on my private land, nowhere near a public street, and I stormed off the porch, demanding to know on what authority she thought she could order my truck removed. The tow driver, clearly uncomfortable, held up a piece of paper Karen had shoved at him, a so-called removal order, with an HOA letterhead that looked like it had been printed off her home computer, and when I explained calmly that this was private property and the HOA had zero jurisdiction here, the driver's eyes widened, and he quickly apologized before backing his rig out of my driveway. Karen shrieked at him, called him incompetent, threatened to have him banned from the community, but he just gave me a knowing look and drove away, leaving Karen red-faced and fuming. But instead of admitting defeat, she doubled down, whipping out her phone to call the sheriff again, loudly announcing that I was harassing her and illegally impeding HOA enforcement. And that was when I knew she had lost her grip on reality, because no amount of delusion could make her fake HOA papers legitimate, and when the same deputy from before arrived, shaking his head with visible annoyance, I handed him the new stack of evidence I had been gathering, and he finally told her point blank, "Karen, you have no authority on this man's land. If you keep filing false reports and trespassing, you're the one who's going to end up in trouble." Instead of backing down, she puffed out her chest and screeched about how the sheriff's office was corrupt and in the pocket of outsiders, while neighbors peeked out from their blinds, and some even recorded the whole thing on their phones. The deputy gave me a look that said, "Just hang tight," and then left after warning her again. But the damage to her reputation was already spreading. People in her own HOA started murmuring that she was embarrassing them, making the whole community look ridiculous, and I could see the cracks forming in her little empire. Still, Karen wasn't done. If anything, my refusal to bend made her more desperate, and within days she was back with yet another fake violation notice, this one claiming I owed back dues to the HOA, dating all the way back to before I'd even inherited the land, as though she could retroactively rope my property into her control. It would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic, but this time I didn't just toss the paper away. I filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office, attaching every shred of evidence I had, and I was told they'd open an investigation into harassment and fraud. I figured that might finally keep her at bay, but instead it only sent her spiraling further, because the very next morning, I woke to the sound of pounding on my door at 5:30 a.m., And when I opened it, Karen was standing there with two of her HOA cronies holding a set of bolt cutters and declaring that she was removing unauthorized fencing on behalf of the board. That was it. The moment she actually stepped onto my land with tools in hand to destroy my property, I grabbed my phone, hit record, and told her flat out that she was trespassing, vandalizing, and that I was calling the sheriff right then and there. She tried to bluster, insisting she had legal authority, but her cronies' faces turned pale, and they backed away fast when they realized I wasn't bluffing. By the time the deputy arrived, this time with a sergeant alongside him, Karen was still ranting, but the evidence on my phone was undeniable, and the sergeant told her in no uncertain terms that if she so much as set 1 foot past my fence line again, she'd be arrested. The look on her face was priceless, like nobody had ever dared to strip away her illusion of power before. But even then, I could tell she wasn't done scheming, because as the officers drove off and I finally felt a moment of peace, I saw her across the street pacing furiously, clutching her phone, clearly plotting her next move. And that next move would be the one that finally brought her entire charade crashing down, because Karen didn't know when to quit, and the law was about to catch up with her once and for all. The showdown finally came on a bright Wednesday afternoon when I was out in the field checking on the irrigation lines Grandpa had installed decades ago, because I suddenly heard the sound of engines revving near the road, and when I looked up I saw a small convoy of cars pulling into my driveway, 3 SUVs plastered with HOA stickers, and Karen herself striding out of the lead vehicle like a general leading her troops into battle, waving a thick folder of papers in one hand and barking orders at the people behind her. She announced, loud enough for every neighbor within earshot to hear, that the HOA board had voted unanimously to seize control of my property for failure to comply with community guidelines, and that she was there to deliver the official eviction notice, which she thrust at me with a smug little smirk, as though I'd have no choice but to pack my things and hand her the keys. But when I unfolded the papers, I almost laughed out loud. It was nothing more than a stack of fake forms copied from random county documents with the words HOA property transfer scribbled across the top in bold font, not a single official seal or signature anywhere. I told her point blank that she was trespassing again, that she was committing fraud, and at this time I was done playing games, while she was ranting about how all property within a 3-mile radius belongs to this HOA by law. I pulled out my phone, dialed the sheriff, and started recording every word she said, making sure her entire little performance was documented. Her face flushed red. But instead of backing off, she escalated. She ordered her followers to start unloading clipboards, tape measures, and even spray paint, telling them to mark violations and document infractions, and I watched in disbelief as 2 of them actually started walking toward my barn, one of them spraying a bright red X on the side before I shouted at them to stop. I reminded them all that this was private land, and if they so much as set foot past the barn, I'd have them arrested for vandalism and trespassing. And while most of them hesitated, glancing nervously at each other, Karen just screamed louder, insisting she had supreme authority from the HOA, waving her fake papers like a badge of honor. Within minutes, the familiar sound of sirens filled the air, and 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled up, deputies stepping out with weary expressions like they already knew exactly who they'd be dealing with. The moment Karen saw them, she ran toward them, flailing her folder and shrieking about how I was an intruder and illegally occupying HOA land, but the deputies barely looked at her before turning to me and asking calmly if I still had the deed and evidence. I handed it over without hesitation, and then I showed them the fresh spray paint on my barn, the recordings of Karen's rant, and the stack of fake notices she had been plastering on my door for weeks. One deputy looked at Karen and said flatly, "Ma'am, you've been warned multiple times. This is criminal trespassing, vandalism, and attempted fraud. And I swear the entire neighborhood must have been watching, because within seconds, Karen's smug little smirk melted into outrage as she realized the deputies weren't backing her up this time. She started screaming about corruption, about how the sheriff's office was conspiring with outsiders to destroy her community, thrashing as the deputies calmly pulled out handcuffs and told her she was under arrest. Her HOA cronies froze in shock, none of them moving to help her, and one by one they slipped back to their SUVs, muttering excuses about how they didn't know it would go this far, leaving Karen alone to face the reality she had created. As the deputies read her rights and walked her toward the cruiser, neighbors poured out of their houses, phones out, recording the entire scene, some even cheering quietly under their breath. Clearly relieved that the tyrant of a neighborhood was finally being taken down a notch. Karen, of course, didn't go quietly. She shouted over and over that she'd sue everyone, that she'd shut down the sheriff's department, that this entire street would pay for disrespecting the HOA queen. But her words lost all their power once the car door slammed shut and the sirens wailed as she was driven away. Standing there with the dust settling, I realized the war she had waged against me had finally backfired. And though I didn't know what charges would ultimately stick, one thing was certain: Karen had finally crossed a line too many times, and the law had caught up with her, leaving her HOA kingdom in shambles and her neighbors free from the grip of her delusions. For the first time since moving back to Grandpa's land, I felt like I could breathe easy, knowing the nightmare was finally over, or so I thought. In the days following Karen's arrest, the neighborhood felt almost eerily quiet, as if the very air had been drained of her constant shrieking and clipboard snapping presence. And while most people would have considered that the end of the story, I knew better. People like Karen don't just disappear because they've been embarrassed or locked up once, and sure enough, within 48 hours she was back, bailed out by her husband, though from what I heard through the grapevine, even he was tired of her antics and had warned her to stop. But Karen, ever defiant, strutted back into the neighborhood like nothing had happened, proclaiming that her arrest had been a setup orchestrated by corrupt law enforcement and that she would be vindicated in court. And for a moment, I thought she might actually tone down her crusade after being humiliated in front of everyone, but instead she pivoted to a new strategy: smearing me publicly. Flyers started appearing in mailboxes around the community with my name on them, accusing me of being a squatter, a criminal, even a drug dealer, claiming that Grandpa's land was being used for illicit purposes and that the entire HOA needed to unite to drive me out. Most of the neighbors who had witnessed the spectacle of her arrest weren't buying it, but a few of her diehard supporters whispered in corners and gave me suspicious looks when I drove past, and I realized Karen was trying to salvage her power by waging a propaganda campaign. I wasn't about to let her rewrite reality, so I doubled down on my own approach: meticulous documentation. Every flyer, every recording of her standing on the sidewalk yelling slander across the road, every voicemail she left on my phone, I saved it all, neatly organized in a binder that was starting to look thicker than a college textbook, because I knew sooner or later her lies would land her in more trouble. Meanwhile, her reputation within the HOA was crumbling. Several families quietly approached me to apologize for her behavior, admitting they never liked how controlling she was but had been too afraid to stand up to her. And one even confessed that they were considering leaving the HOA altogether because of her endless drama. That little bit of solidarity gave me hope. But Karen wasn't finished. Her desperation grew more erratic by the day, until one evening, just as I was sitting on the porch with a cold drink, I heard rustling near the barn and went to investigate, only to find Karen herself sneaking around with a flashlight and a camera, snapping photos as if she were building a case for some imaginary court trial. When I shouted at her to stop, she screamed that she was gathering evidence of my violations and bolted toward the fence, tripping over her own feet and nearly face-planting in the dirt before scrambling away like a raccoon caught raiding a garbage can. I reported it immediately, and when the deputies came out again, they warned her in no uncertain terms that another stunt like that would violate her bail conditions and land her right back in jail. But Karen, instead of being humbled, doubled down once more, calling the local news station to spin her arrest into some story about government overreach and tyranny against homeowners, though the reporter who came out quickly realized she was unhinged and ended up doing a balance piece that actually painted me in a sympathetic light. That was the final straw for many in the HOA. Neighbors began openly turning against her, complaining to the board that she had dragged them into lawsuits, bad press, and public humiliation, and whispers spread that a recall vote was in the works to strip her of her self-proclaimed title as president for life. I watched it all unfold with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism, because while she was clearly unraveling, people like Karen often burn the brightest just before they finally flame out, and I had a feeling that her last desperate act of control would be the one that destroyed her entirely. What I didn't know then was just how spectacular her downfall would be, because Karen wasn't just losing her grip on the HOA, she was about to lose her freedom altogether when her antics finally crossed into criminal territory that no amount of denial or bluster could save her from. Karen's downfall came quicker than even I expected, and it happened on a hot summer afternoon when most of the neighborhood was either mowing lawns or lounging in their backyard, because while her smear campaigns, fake notices, and late night trespassing had already made her a pariah, the final nail in her coffin came when she decided that if the HOA couldn't officially force me off Grandpa's land, she would take matters into her own hands. And that reckless decision was the one that ended everything for her. I was in the barn repairing one of the old tractors when I heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel and stepped outside to see Karen in her SUV parked crookedly at the edge of my field, her door wide open as she stood there waving a crowbar in one hand like some kind of vigilante, shouting at me that I had 10 minutes to vacate before she would start dismantling violations herself. And for a moment, I thought she was bluffing until she marched straight toward my fence and swung the crowbar against one of the wooden posts, splintering it with a loud crack. I pulled out my phone immediately and began recording, my voice calm but firm as I told her she was destroying private property and that she was being recorded for evidence, but she was too far gone to listen. She smashed another fence post, screaming that the HOA owns this land and that she was enforcing the law. And just then, several neighbors, drawn by the noise, came out onto their lawns, watching in stunned silence as Karen raged like a wild animal, her face red, hair flying, words incoherent. Some even started filming too, realizing this was the spectacle that would finally expose her for good. And as if on cue, a deputy's cruiser rolled down the road. Responding to the call, I'd already made the moment she stepped out with the crowbar. When the deputy pulled up and saw Karen mid-swing, he didn't waste time with warnings. He shouted for her to drop the weapon, and when she refused, yelling about how outsiders can't control the HOA, he drew his taser and repeated the order. She froze for a moment, looking around at all the cameras, perhaps realizing that this time she couldn't twist the narrative, then shrieked about being a political prisoner as she finally dropped the crowbar and tried to storm back to her SUV. But the deputy was faster, pinning her arms behind her back and cuffing her as the entire neighborhood erupted in whispers, gasps, and even a few relieved cheers. This time there was no getting out on bail, no brushing it off as a misunderstanding between the vandalism, the trespassing, the fake documents, the false reports, and now resisting lawful orders with a weapon in hand. Karen was hit with a slew of charges that made her HOA allies abandon her entirely, leaving her standing alone as the queen of a kingdom that no longer wanted her. I stood there quietly, watching as she was loaded into the cruiser for the second and final time, her voice hoarse from screaming threats and promises of revenge. But I knew, deep down, this was the end of her reign. The next week, the HOA held a meeting where the board unanimously voted to strip her of her so-called presidency, issuing an apology to the community, and even to me for allowing her to run unchecked for so long. And though I didn't particularly care about their politics, it was satisfying to see justice finally ripple outward. The barn was repainted where she'd sprayed her red. The broken fence replaced sturdier than before, and for the first time since moving back, I felt like Grandpa's land was at peace again, free from the shadow of her obsessive control. Neighbors who had once peeked nervously through blinds now waved when I drove past, some stopping by to chat about farming or to share stories about how Karen had tormented them too. And I realized her arrest hadn't just freed me. It had freed the entire community from years of petty tyranny. In the end, Karen didn't just lose her grip on my land, she lost everything she had built her identity on, and though I don't know what became of her after the court hearings and the fallout, I do know that her name became a cautionary tale whispered around backyard barbecues and HOA meetings, the story of the woman who thought she ruled everyone, only to be reminded, in the most public way possible, that the law rules over all. And as I stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees, Grandpa once planted with his own hands, I couldn't help but smile, because Karen's chaos had taught me a simple but powerful truth. On this land, my family's land, no HOA, no self-proclaimed queen, and certainly no Karen would ever have the power to take it away from me again.